In this video, you're going to get a comprehensive history of US-Cuban relations and context for Obama's historic visit to Cuba. This is a bit longer than my normal videos, but I promise that if you stick around to the end, I'll explain why these developments are perhaps the most consequential of this decade, if not this century. The last presidential visit to Cuba before Obama was Calvin Coolidge in 1928. It was a relaxed journey, and apparently the biggest controversy of the trip focused on how Coolidge managed to avoid the island rum following him around Havana. It was the height of America's prohibition on alcohol, after all. So how did US-Cuba relations deteriorate? There's one word that begins and ends our story: hegemony. Simplified, hegemony means diplomatic dominance, the equivalent of a business monopoly but from a country. It's what the US developed in Latin America at the dawn of the 20th century and solidified during the Cold War. Unchallengeable influence. And as we'll see, efforts to protect this hegemony brought us to the brink of nuclear war. You may have learned about the Monroe Doctrine in school. It was the 1823 declaration by President James Monroe that said that continued European colonialism in North and South America would be seen as aggression against the United States. We study it now, but it was pretty much ignored at the time of its publishing. The US was weak militarily, and the doctrine was an obvious empty threat by the United States to leverage undeserved influence in Latin America. This was true until the turn of the 20th century. American eyes were on Cuba in 1895, as it attempted for the third time to fight for independence from colonial Spain. As the conflict dragged on into 1898, US business interests, especially the sugar industry, wanted an end to the conflict. In New York, newspapers from William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer drummed up animosity towards the Spanish through yellow journalism. Then Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, longed for armed conflict with Spain, as he believed it was the way for America to become truly great as a nation and to become the dominant force in the hemisphere. On February 15, 1898, the U.S. ship Maine sunk in Havana Harbor. Media blamed the Spanish for the catastrophe. The resulting pressure on President McKinley from the press, the public, and business led to a declaration of war with Spain. The U.S. dominated the surprisingly unorganized and underfinanced Spanish military, and among other things, freed Cuba at the end of the successful war, with one big catch. Now, the U.S. said that they had no interest in governing over Cuba, but through the Teller Amendment signed after the war, maintained the right to intervene in Cuba if needed for the maintenance of good government. This Teller Amendment was utilized various times during Cuban instability between 1900 and 1953, and was a pretext for propping up Fulgencio Batista, who served one term as elected Cuban president, but then canceled the 1952 election through a military coup in order to stay in office. Batista's coup, corruption, and antagonization of the Cuban people led to something called El Movimiento, the movement, in 1953, a revolution led by Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and Che Guevara. In 1959, they successfully removed Batista from power. 4 months after taking over the Cuban government, Fidel Castro had a controversial trip to the USA that would set up apocalyptic conflict. During his 11-day tour, Fidel was avoided by President Eisenhower, who was nervous about Castro's communist tendency. Despite Castro's statement assuring, "I have said very clear that we are not communists," the American government was obviously pretty skeptical. Fidel did have one meeting with Vice President Richard Nixon, who later declared him either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline. President Eisenhower began drafting plans to remove Castro by force. In 1961, a U.S.-trained militia of anti-revolutionary Cubans attempted to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs and overthrow the Castro government. They failed badly. After a few days of fighting, the 1,500 invaders were either dead or captured. The failure was a major embarrassment for the US and brought the Cuban government in closer relations with the Soviet Union. As a matter of deterring further American meddling, Castro convinced the Soviets to assemble nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba and aim them directly at the United States. These missiles were discovered by an American U-2 spy plane in October 1962, leading to a tense 13-day nuclear standoff.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it came to be called, was negotiated to an end by President Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Khrushchev, and the nuclear weapons were removed in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba ever again. US-Cuban relations seemed permanently damaged. A series of embargoes starting in 1960 ended imports and exports and the vast majority of travel between the two countries. Even the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did little to thaw relations, which is why the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Havana after 54 years was such a big deal, why the lifted travel restrictions for Americans visiting Cuba are groundbreaking, why the presidential visit is monumental. US-Cuba relations were just so bad for so long. Now, let's go deeper with this topic. The 2008 presidential campaign. There were really two opposing voices. One pushed by the children of the Cold War, an era when, from a US perspective, there was only good and evil, the USA and the Soviet Union. Many of our politicians and the people voting for them grew up hiding under their school desks in hopes of protecting themselves from a nuclear weapon. The fear of nuclear apocalypse was real and part of daily routine. These Americans carried a perspective in which if you found a foreign government unamenable, you simply removed them. Sure, sometimes communism was resisted through direct conflicts like in Korea or Vietnam, but mostly it was clandestine, like by funding the so-called freedom fighters in Afghanistan to resist the Soviet invasion. This was especially true in Latin America. If a government was democratically elected but seemingly too leftist for the US, the CIA would simply organize a coup d'etat of that government, install a military junta that was more friendly to the US. And if leaders of those countries challenged US business interests, the CIA would ensure that they disappear. In 1954, the CIA deposed democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz and replaced him with a series of US-backed dictators. 1964, Brazilian President João Goulart is replaced by a military regime designed and supported by the US. 1973, the US coordinated a military coup d'etat against Chilean President Salvador Allende in response to his Marxist collectivist policies. The list goes on and on. Haiti, Uruguay, Bolivia, Argentina, El Salvador, Peru, Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, all these places, the CIA either installed dictators, armed US-favored rebel groups, empowered already US-friendly regimes to repress revolution, and in many cases, torture dissidents into submission. Look at the power the USA had. This is the hegemony I mentioned earlier. Complete US dominance of Latin America. You don't like a government, you get rid of that government. The US morphed country after country to be as we wanted, except for one, Cuba. Cuba didn't work for hegemony. Cuba resisted US attempts to overthrow its government. It remained throughout the Cold War, and remains today, a fossil of the Soviet way of running a government. Food shortages and imprisoning political opposition, of impassioned leaders in jumpsuits and people trying to nearly cause nuclear wars. But beyond all that, Cuba never crumbled to US hegemony like the others. And that's the context for another perspective that appeared in the 2008 election. A voice for whom childhood nuclear drills may have seemed more distant. A new generation that saw the same people who installed governments to their liking in Latin America or Southeast Asia trying and failing to do the same in Iraq and Afghanistan, threatening to start another conflict in Iran, watching in terror as Chinese businesses began loaning money to and interacting with countries in Latin America and Africa, threatening the hegemony that we had enjoyed for 100 years. The Soviet Union was gone. The world wasn't black and white anymore. The old tricks were leading to anger and chaos. The paradigm had shifted. Like in Cuba, we were being resisted, but there was more resistance than we ever knew before, and an intense sadness and denial among our leaders that America's best days may very well be behind us. But there was this new perspective that wasn't so negative. The new perspective said that the 21st century wasn't going to be, indeed couldn't be, a repeat of the 20th century. But that also didn't mean America had to take a back seat or retreat to the corner. Rather than ultimatums, there could be subtlety. Rather than launching threats and black ops across oceans, we could open embassies. Rather than retreating from dialogue, we could openly disagree with foreign leaders right to their face in front of the whole world. That we could at least speak with the island nation only 90 miles off our coast despite our checkered past. I'm not here to tell you that Obama's foreign policy was a good foreign policy. I'm not going to pose that a less domineering role on the world stage will always work out beautifully for the US. But I will tell you this. When the US Embassy reopened in Havana in August, when Obama landed in Havana to formally reopen relations with Cuba, American hegemony ended. A new era began, a culmination of the vision laid out in the 2008 campaign. Obama is handling the world in a fundamentally different way than every president since McKinley intervened in the Cuban War for independence from Spain. And perhaps the biggest question of the 2016 campaign will be, how will the other candidates deal with the cards they've been dealt by 8 years of the Obama Doctrine? If you learned something about the history of US-Cuban relations or Obama's trip to Cuba, please share this video so that others can learn as well. Also, subscribe to Political Junkie News for a deeper understanding of the news and of history. Later, guys.